Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we try to check out important gems that you probably have missed out on because they were suppressed. Magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries coming from obscure sources. And this is Bible Decode 264. We've been checking out the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, or the Flavian origins hypothesis. That is, that the New Testament of the Bible was written not by the disciples of Jesus and so on in Judea, but by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 to 96 AD. That's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the Gospels as a form of psychological warfare against the Jews, who they had just gotten done defeating in a war, decimating in a war, but we're still expecting them to bounce back at some point, which they did, although it took quite a while. And but both Vespasian and Titus were members of the military, fighting generals in the war, fighting against the Jews from 66 to 73. Actually, Vespasian was named emperor in 69, so he basically took care of the first half of the war and appointed his son Titus to take care of the second half once Vespasian was named emperor and moved back to Rome. Now, you have to recall that this was the year of the four emperors. And so Emperor Nero was assassinated in 68. His successor, Galba, was also assassinated in 69. His successor, Otho, was assassinated also in 69. And so was his successor, Vitellius. And so when Vespasian gets the call to become emperor, even if you got the call to become emperor of the Roman Empire, you might be a little bit reticent, knowing that your four predecessors were all murdered in the last 12 months. And so you can suspect that Vespasian might have been a little bit paranoid about being the emperor and wanted to take action to shore up his position there as emperor. And so Titus and Vespasian, knowing that the Jews, seeing that the Jews were part of the resistance, as well as many of the legions, the Roman legions, the soldiers, and the slaves, this psychological operation was really targeted toward all groups, but the Jews first and foremost. They knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, a military commander to rise up and overthrow the Romans, kick them out of Judea, which almost happened in this war. That's how it got started. They kicked out Herod Agrippa II from Jerusalem, sent him packing back to Rome, and required Nero to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. So, instead of a Jewish Messiah who was a military commander, Vespasian and Titus decided to write a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the Roman slave-owning centurion was the greatest faith in all of Israel. And so that kind of sets the stage for the psyop. Now, how did they do it? They wrote the story about Jesus, but at the same time, they wrote a story about the war, a history of this war against the Jews, called Jewish War or War of the Jews, written under the name of Flavius Josephus. Okay, so he's a member of the Flavians, even though he was Jewish by birth. According to his autobiography, he eventually surrendered to Vespasian. He was one of the military commanders for the Jews. Surrendered to Vespasian and defected to the Romans when he saw that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. Predicted Vespasian would become emperor. Vespasian, when he did become emperor, pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, adopted him as a member of his family, and put him up in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, giving him the time and resources to write the history in 7 volumes. Now, if you read these 7 volumes, you'll hear echoes from the New Testament. If you read the books together, the parallels between the two will begin to jump off the page. Michael Menescotts did this exercise, and he found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And then he charted them on a graph. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plotted the points of all of the parallels, and they formed 5 almost perfect letters of the same size in Latin, the language of the emerging Roman Caesars, or the emerging language of the Roman Caesars. They both spoke Greek and Latin. And incidentally, if you don't know this, the Gospels were originally written in Greek, and Josephus was also originally written in Greek, even though in the foreword to Josephus it says that the original was written in the father tongue, which most people consider to be Chaldee, but Menescotts himself argues that the father tongue means that it was originally written by Vespasian the father, and that it was augmented in the edition that comes down to us, because that original version has been lost. The version that's come down to us was written by Titus. So the father tongue in that context is just that it was originally written by Vespasian. Now it's the version that we have was written by Titus. But of course, they didn't really write it. It was just like their court intellectual, court historians, and other people, probably some of the Herod family and some other Jewish defectors, or what you call Hellenized Jews, such as Tiberius Alexander. They were probably all in on it. But that's just a drop in the bucket of the parallels. Also, you consider that this was exactly the MO of the Romans. They used psychological warfare. In particular, they created a number of other religions for psychological purposes at this time. The Romans really were the only people to have the opportunity and the resources to do this, given that they had full control of censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. And then all of the themes involved, not just the 250 parallels in the book of Luke, many of which are quite strong, and also the parallels between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus. If you read the War of the Jews, you can see Titus go from here to there, fighting battles, having adventures, having difficulties. And then when you look at the Gospels, and the book of Luke in particular, every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location that are separated in time by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And we're talking about 40 plus separate events that are all in the same order. This was discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, especially the Flavian Signature edition, and also his later book Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. Turns out that Willie the Sheikh also was aware of the fact that the Romans wrote the New Testament, and that every one of her plays is about the fact that the Romans wrote the New Testament. And she was named Amelia Bassano Lanier. She was a Jew and was working at the court of, her whole family moved from Italy to England to work at the court of Henry VIII as the court musicians. And she was born a couple generations later during the late Elizabethan era and early King James era. And so the Shakespearean corpus is really a counterattack of the Gospels or the New Testament. The Gospels were written as a psychological operation against the Jews. Shakespearean corpus is a psychological operation against the Romans or against the Gentiles from the Jews. Also, you can see that the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament, particularly the prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that destruction of Jerusalem was a sign of his second coming. And then you read the War of the Jews to discover that the destruction of Jerusalem was fulfilled by Titus. Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And this was actually a majority view of theologians up until the 20th century. Most theologians understood that Titus was the second coming of Jesus, and that Armageddon and all of the events of the book of Revelation occurred in the 1st century AD. 70 AD was the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, we're looking at kind of an adjacent idea here from the book from Robert Eisenman that is called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And he doesn't know most of his writing. This is kind of a compilation of a couple of his short books and other chapters and articles that he's written. We're reading chapter 4 here called Paul as Herodian. And so this is basically because Paul, now I didn't really mention this, but Jesus is basically utterly deferential to the Romans. This is another, telltale sign or red flag of how Jesus is, rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile and so on. At the same time, he's overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers, and he's castigating the Jewish merchants selling pigeons and doves for the sacrifice. He's taking aim at the Jewish rituals, traditions, and family. He tells his disciples to abandon their families, his Jewish disciples. And so that's a red flag. That who is this Jew who is being so anti-Jew and pro-Roman at the same time? And then Paul comes along and he's even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus was. And so Eisenman is perplexed by this, and he writes this article, Paul is Herodian, really going through all of the sources, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls, but many of the like pseudo-Clementine literature and the Apocrypha to dig up, really doing the name game. There's a ton of names in the book of Acts and in the Pauline epistles of people that, Paul gives a shout out to or mentions in passing, and we don't really think too much of who they are. But a lot of them are either Herods from the, dynasty following Herod the King and Herod the Great, and they were the puppet government of Judea from that appointed by Rome, and several other of the people that Paul is hobnobbing with are actual Flavians. They're actually members of the Roman royalty, but we don't really talk about that. So Eisenman just has a wealth of breadth of knowledge of the sources at this time, and he pieces together this to figure out that Paul is actually a member of the Herod family. Now, it's much more tidy to just say that Paul is total fiction. Just like Jesus is total fiction, the whole thing is a psychological operation from the Romans. But it's also instructive to look at the process that Eisenman goes through to get to where he gets to. We are, I think, toward the end of this article, but let's tune in right here. The description of Saulus as an intermediary here between the chief priests and principal Pharisees, the Herodian king, and the Romans is interesting in the parallel it provides with material in Acts relating to Saul's commission a quarter century before from the high priest to go and arrest, quote, Christians. Directly, there weren't really any Christians at this point in time, is the problem. Directly following the temple wall affair, too, because James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, they were leading a group called the Nazarenes, and the Nazarenes were maybe what you would call Jewish Christians. They believed in, maybe believed in Jesus's, being Son of God, but they clung to the Jewish traditions and rituals, the circumcision and the Sabbath and the sacrifices and the kosher food laws. The Christians are the ones who rejected those things. They rejected the circumcision. They rejected Saturday Sabbath. They rejected, animal sacrifice, believing that Jesus himself was a sacrificial lamb that allowed them not to do that anymore. So those Christians didn't really exist. And so that also shows how the persecution of Christians by first century Roman emperors was not. That was not persecution of Christians. It was a persecution of Jews. The Romans supported the Christians. Most of the Flavian, post-Titus Flavians, they were Christians. Now, his younger brother Domitian did actually put to death a few Christians, but he didn't put them to death because they were Christians. He put them to death because he was opposed to them, kind of for other reasons. Now, okay, directly following the Temple Wall affair, too, and James's stoning in 62 AD, Josephus had pictured his Saulus and Costobarus as leading a band of thugs in rioting in Jerusalem, which in particular would seem to have involved stealing the tithes of the poorer priests on behalf of these same rich high priests, so that many of the former died from want. In this episode, we have a further echo of possible compromising relationships with the high priest. Finally, like Paul in Acts, Josephus's Saulus also seems to have sent or made an appeal or been sent to Nero, whereas Paul's appeal in Acts comes in approximately 60 AD, just before or around the time of the Temple Wall affair directed against Herodians, which climaxed in the stoning of James and his elimination from the scene. The Saulus in Josephus goes to see Nero 6 years later in 66 AD at Corinth, also a favorite locale of the New Testament, Paul's activities to debrief him on the situation in Palestine and the events described above. It is this report that finally causes Nero to dispatch the best Roman general, Vespasian, from Britain to Palestine to put down the revolt and, of course, the epoch-making events following upon this. Here, both Josephus and Acts fall silent on their respective Sauluses. Now, I don't quite understand the Saulus character, but you do have to also keep in mind, and this is the devastating nature of the Roman origins hypothesis. It takes out the entire New Testament as being fiction. And that includes the story of Jesus, and that also includes Satan. Satan is a creation of the Roman Caesars. Now, there is a Satan in the Old Testament, but that Satan is a human. It's an obstacle or an adversary. There's only about a handful of Satans in the Old Testament, but they all refer to humans. The supernatural version of Satan doesn't come around until the New Testament written by the Romans, and really doesn't actually come around until much later with the writings of Dante, Milton, and especially the works of Hollywood. The real Satan that we kind of picture in our head is a 20th century concoction, and bolstered by the 21st century. But it's also devastating in that it also means that Josephus is entirely fiction as well. And Josephus is the major work of the first century and cited by all ancient historians because it's really like the only source for many different aspects of first century history and even first century BC history. It takes out Josephus too as not being reliable because he was in on this psychological operation, as well as many other of the famous Roman authors from this time period who were also Roman Flavians, or at the Flavian court. That includes Tacitus. That includes it includes Seneca the Younger, who was in on it. Probably before the Flavians even got in there. He was assassinated by Nero, or put to death by Nero in 65 AD. Also, Suetonius and Emperor Trajan was in on it, and Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder. They were both in on it. So these people can't really be taken seriously either. And then it also sheds light on a lot of authors of literature between the 16th and the 20th century, who all knew about this as well, such as J.R.R. Tolkien, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Lev Tolstoy, C.S. Lewis, Mary Shelley. The list goes on. So this little Roman origins hypothesis is going to end up in the long run, once it's proven, which I think it was by Menescats with his Flavian, with the signature, the fact that there are 5 Roman letters that were plotted onto the book of Luke, APTVS, Titus Vespasian, with a T and the V. And so the Romans literally signed their names or put their initials on the book of Luke, just so that we would discover it at some point. And so this discovery is coming out by hook or by crook. And I am dedicating the rest of my life to getting it out there, because once we cleanse ourselves from this, this also takes out Islam as well. If you read the works of Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, who were the original people to kind of do the shell game with names to figure this out by going over all these Roman letters between Pliny and Trajan and Tacitus and so on. But it's going to take out all of the Western religions, which I consider to be 5, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, atheism, and otherwise known as scientism, and Satanism. All of them are no longer tenable, and we all have to kind of pick up the pieces and recognize that what we need is 8 billion different religions. Everyone has their own individual religion of how they see their creator manifesting in the world, and to use some discipline and some intelligence in how to follow that and how to cultivate that in their own lives. And there are many steps to that. I think I've gone over all this in the Reciprocal Church in early videos, maybe the first 100 videos of the Reciprocal Church. But the golden mean, sacred geometry, sacred music, really the quadrivium, music, astronomy, mathematics, and geometry. That's where you can find the most unfiltered and authentic version of the Creator God. Okay, now let's get back to Eisenman here. So what I'm saying here is that Eisenman, he doesn't know this, and so he uses Josephus as a legitimate source. He assumes that Josephus is attempting to tell the truth. Okay, it is curious, the Antiquities, and Antiquities is Josephus's second work that he wrote in the 90s. The War of the Jews was in the 70s. In the 90s, he wrote the 20-volume Jewish Antiquities, or Antiquities of the Jews. And there are some tidbits in there as well, but it is curious. The Antiquities places this picture of the riot its solace leads in Jerusalem immediately after its 2 descriptions of the plundering of the tithes of the poor priests by the rich chief priests and the stoning of James. For its part, Acts refers to the riotous behavior in Jerusalem of the man it, too, is calling Saulus. But it places this event after problems over the distribution of collection monies, the conversion of a large group of Jewish priests, and this stoning of Stephen in Acts 6. The sequencing in both narratives is virtually the same as it is in the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions. The German scholar H.G. Scheps was the first to remark the resemblance of the stoning of Stephen to this stoning of James. And the more one examines it, the more the convergence of the 2 episodes becomes absolute, including the vision both have of the Son of Man standing on the right hand of power. For James, he is sitting, and the words both are reported as uttering before dying. The overlap here is just impossible to deny. Well, that kind of indicates that these Pseudo-Clementine recognitions are maybe the source for the book of Acts here. but it's also, or maybe this is the source for Josephus, but it's all the same, because Clement of Rome, from these pseudo-Clementine recognitions, the Clement is Clement of Rome, who was a Flavian, and he became like the fourth pope, or possibly the second pope, behind Peter, or Bishop of Rome. And so none of these works can be taken seriously, but if any were, it would be the pseudo-Clementines more than these others. But, you know, Clement was a member of the Flavian dynasty. The pseudo-Clementine recognitions present a third version of these events. In it, Saulus did lead a riot in the 40s and did attack James, but James did not die in the attack. He was only injured and instead was carried down by his followers to the Jericho area, where he lived to send out Peter on his first missionary journey to Caesarea. It is curious that whereas Acts may have transposed the stoning of James in the 60s with the stoning of Stephen in the 40s, when the recognitions claims Paul did attack on James in the temple, Josephus may have done just the opposite, meaning transposed Saul's riotous behavior in Jerusalem in the 40s with its analog, the riot led by Saulus in the 60s after the stoning of James. It's unfortunate Eisenman has to go through this process of trying to figure this out, because if he had access to the Roman origins hypothesis, he would just be able to just say, you know, all of this is just bogus. You know, they're just, you know, they're you know, just picking and choosing stuff and moving it around, and none of it is legitimate because it's all propaganda. This is all part of a psychological operation. It will probably never be possible to sort out the facts concerning this tangle of events in our triangle of sources and what transpositions occurred, if any. However, in order to contend that Saulus and Paul are identical, one would have to assume that Paul, after his appeal to Nero, did return to Jerusalem. This is not as implausible as it may appear at first impression, because, as we saw, our sources fall uncharacteristically silent on the subject of Paul's last years, and, for instance, the matter of his proposed trip to Spain alluded to in Romans 15:28, not to mention the fates of all important leaders such as Peter, James, and Paul. Where Saulus is concerned, aside